Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." So, has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History. So I'm pretty sure you've heard the hymn Amazing Grace. I've read that it's performed 10 million times around the world every year. And that's just public performances. It doesn't count all the times when it's sung in churches. But I don't know if everyone knows who was the author of this hymn and what an adventurous life he led, how he helped stop the slave trade, and how he faithfully preached the gospel. His name was John Newton. Stay with us as we discover more about this important preacher here on Kids Talk Church History. I am Grace. I am 13 years old, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I'm Sean. I'm 13, and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
I'm Priscilla, and I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm 11 years old.
Before becoming a major voice in the anti-slavery movement, Newton worked in the slave trading business, right?
Yes, he worked on slave ships from England, his homeland, but once he became enslaved too.
Who enslaved him?
It's a long story, but basically he was not a good sailor. He was often disrespectful and disobedient and did not get along with his captains. Once, while the boat was chained in Sierra Leone, Africa, his captain died, and the man who took his place made it clear that he didn't want to put up with Newton's behavior. So Newton chose to stay in Africa with a man who would become rich through the slave trade, Mr. Chow.
What did he want to do?
He wanted to work with Chow and become rich too, but it didn't work out. He was mistreated by Chow's wife, an African woman known as P.I. When he was sick with a fever, she just gave him a few scraps of food from her plate. He was so hungry that he ate some roots from plants, but that got him even sicker because he couldn't wash them, and you can imagine what happened.
It's truly amazing that he survived.
Yes, he was so pitiful that the Africans who had been enslaved by Chow secretly brought him some food.
I guess you remember that later, especially when he fought against slavery. He was treated like a slave, and the only people who helped him were slaves.
He definitely remembered. We know all these things because he wrote them in a book. And he wasn't just treated like a slave. He became an actual slave when someone lied about him, saying that he stole something from Chow. Chow was so angry that he chained Newton outside and left him there in the hot African sun and torrential rains. Then he made him plant lime trees together with the other slaves.
He seemed to go from one trouble to another. He eventually got free, went back to working on ships, but then he almost died in a terrible storm.
Yes, we could go on and on telling about his adventures and misadventures, but our listeners will have to read about them themselves.
But we should take some time to talk about the time when he almost died in a storm, because it was pivotal in his life. The storm was so scary that Newton prayed for the first time in many years.
What did he say?
He was talking to the captain about a possible remedy and said, "If this will not do, the Lord have mercy on us." He was surprised at his own words because he had not called on God for a long time.
The story honestly reminds me of Jonah, who told the captain the storm was his fault because he was disobeying God.
Yes, all of a sudden he realized he really needed God, just like Jonah in the belly of the fish who said, "Salvation is of the Lord."
Was he a Christian before he became a sailor?
Yes, he grew up as a Christian. His mother especially taught him a lot, but she died when he was almost 7. Then he eventually turned his back on God in spite of all his troubles.
Right, and when God saved him from the storm, he continued to pray and read scriptures. After he landed, he started to go to church.
But unfortunately, he continued to work in the slave trade.
Yes, for a while. It took him some time to understand how wrong it was. Soon he found a job as a surveyor overseeing the goods coming to England on ships, so he could get out of the trade. And the more he read the Bible, the more he wanted to become a pastor.
Then there's also a love story. He was in love with a girl named Polly Catlett. This love started when he was 17 and she was 13. I've read that it was this love that kept Newton from getting totally discouraged in his worst moments, because he kept hoping to see her again.
Yes, and I think they exchanged letters. Then, when he got a good job, he proposed to her.
She actually proposed to him because he was so shy that he couldn't say anything. But she knew what he was going to say, so she said she'd be happy to marry him. So they married. He was 25 and she was 21.
That's so romantic.
And of course, he eventually became a pastor. He wrote hymns to go along with his sermons.
We have so many hymns by John Newton in our hymnal. Besides Amazing Grace, one of my favorites is Though Troubles Assail Us.
I like Let Us Love and Sing and Wonder, and How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds in a Believer's Ear.
My favorite has to be the classic Amazing Grace. It doesn't get old.
There's so much to say about John Newton, but we really should let our expert tell us more. He's Reverend Jonathan Aitken, priest in the Church of England and author of the biography John Newton, From Disgrace to Amazing Grace. Reverend Aitken, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be joining you, and congratulations on all the study you've obviously done so far on Newton. You've got a pretty good, between you, a great grasp of him and his extraordinary importance in history, in religion, in theology, and in his influence on the Christian world today. Where should we begin? Well, perhaps where you began at the beginning. He was, and interrupt me with questions if you want to at any stage. Don't let me do the talking. But he started life, on the whole, as a pretty bad boy. Not quite. He was brought up, as I think Grace reminded us, until about the age of 7 by a very Christian mother. And he went to a very Christian church where there were very fine pastors and musicians. And this time of year, we sometimes sing When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And that was written by the pastor of the church which Newton was in. So he was hearing good church music at a very early age. But after his mother died, he became a very wild boy and young man, and committed every imaginable sin of drink, sex, bad behavior. And although his father took him on some seafaring trips where he couldn't behave so badly because he was on board a ship, but nevertheless, you'd have to say that John Newton's youth was wildly misspent. And it went on being misspent for some time. He wanted to get rich quick. Lots of people like that these days. And Newton's way to get rich was to get into the slave trade, which was not a disgraceful trade in those days. Everyone thought it was rather respectable. It's astonishing to think that the slave trade was respected. But the Church of England, for example, had big investments in the slave trade. So he wasn't thought to be a disgrace by being a slave ship captain. And he was a good seaman, and he went out and did a lot of slave trading. And then I think it was Sean who highlighted the importance of the big storm which struck his ship on the way back from one of his slavery expeditions. And this great storm was so serious that the ship was sinking. And Newton, who was an able and tough young man, took the helm of the ship. And against all the odds, he steered it through this vicious storm. And while he was steering it, he remembered some of his mother's teachings. And he'd also recently been reading a book, it was the only book on board the ship he could find, called The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, which is an old-fashioned book, but in its day was the second biggest world bestseller after the Bible. And while Newton was really, like the ship, about to die, about to drown on this very badly damaged ship, he said, Lord, I'm willing to believe in all this stuff which my mother taught me. I'm willing to believe in what I read in this great book, The Imitation of Christ. If you will save me and save this ship, I will follow you. And against all the odds, the ship did not sink. It just managed to struggle through the storm and limp, badly damaged and smashed into a port in Northern Ireland. And the first thing he went was then to go into church and start to pray in a church in Londonderry. You might think that was the sort of beginning of Newton's Christian journey, but not so fast. Newton went back to the slave trade. He, for about 4 years, he captained other slave ships, went out to Africa, and engaged in all the bad habits that slave ship captains did. He was quite a brutal at times. He almost certainly had sex adventures with African women and so on. But still nagging away in his mind was the message, I should follow Jesus. And one of his ports, he met up with a fellow captain, not a slave ship captain, called Alexander Cluny, who was a great Christian. And Cluny said, you must really take God deeply seriously, pray more, read the Bible more, which he did. And when he got back to England, Newton started to attend Cluny's church, which was somewhere in Stepney, what was called at that time a dissenting church. And Newton then started a proper Christian journey and started to pray. And he met up with some of the great Methodist preachers of the time, two great men of God, one called Wesley, John Wesley, other called Whitfield, George Whitfield, who were remarkable preachers. And Newton started then to really follow God as a Methodist, kind of assistant preacher, and then a preacher himself. Now, that's the introduction to how Newton became a Christian. We've hardly got anywhere, but any questions so far of what I've talked about before we move on to how? Yes, Grace.
Well, I have a really quick question. So, what made you want to write a book about John Newton?
Me, personally?
Yeah.
Well, I think of myself, at least part of the time, as a professional author, and particularly a biographer. And I have written big biographies, bestsellers, I should tell you, a biography of Margaret Thatcher, a biography of the none too popular, but now his reputation is rising again, the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon, who had a lot of godly training, incidentally, even though he sinned like many people do at one point. So I was a professional biographer. And professional biographers and writers, they look around for people to write about, who is interesting. But something else happened in my life by this time, that I had become a committed Christian. So I looked around perhaps for someone in the Christian world to write about. And why Newton? Well, because biography is really the story of a life. And Newton's life is about as colorful and dramatic and interesting as you can find. I mean, that wild youth we were talking about, the slave trade, which was vicious and nasty, but he was part of it. And then his change, his great conversion to being a Christian, and then what he did as a Christian, and we'll come on to that in a moment, helping to abolish the slave trade, writing amazing hymns, and being a great Christian writer. So if you're looking for a big story, I said, well, my goodness, Newton deserves it to be written about. So that's why I chose it. I was a biographer in search of a subject, a writer in search of a story, and I thought, wow, this is it. So I'll do it. So I did.
So I also read that it took a long time for Newton to understand what the Bible really taught about like salvation and the Christian life. So much so that even after his storm experience, he thought he was not a true Christian. Can you explain how he matured in his faith?
How short? First of all, it is not uncommon in many Christian lives for there to be long delays, long pauses, doubts, reversals, going back to sinning. This is not at all unusual in the Christian life, and indeed even in the lives of the disciples. I mean, you look at Peter, who sort of slipped up a few times in a very bad way, denying Christ. So there's nothing odd about Newton stopping and starting and going backwards. Why did he go backwards? Well, I think there were temptations. Money making was one of them. He wanted to go back to earning profitable living of the slave trade. He had his doubts. And rather interestingly, I think this is almost a matter of theological argument and speech rather than reality. But Newton never used the word my conversion. Great surprise. He talked about my great turning point, which in my view is probably the same thing. But Newton always thought it was different. And his moment on that ship when it was sinking, and he prayed and he asked God to save him, he called that always my great turning point, not my conversion. So Newton took his time, and we can't explain really why he took his time, except to say that many, many other Christians have taken their time and delayed and stumbled and faltered on the road to commitment or conversion. And that's, I think, the answer to your question.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else got a question?
Did any friends influence his faith before he became a pastor? Because we touched a little bit on Alexander Clume and you elaborated upon that. But besides him, was there any other ones?
There must have been, but we don't know about them because he didn't write about them and we can't be sure. But I think it's a near certainty that whereas Clooney got him into a church, which was called something like the Stepney Dissenters Chapel, he then went off riding quite often around these country tracks in outer London to other churches, and he must have ridden or walked or talked with other Christians who must have influenced. So I don't think Clooney was the only influence, but the only one we really know about and can name. But I'm pretty sure we could say that Newton must have met other friends who influenced him at that time. God comes to people through other people very often.
How did Newton influence the anti-slavery movement?
Well, that's a big question. And let me move to sort of part two of the Newton story, which is after being not converted, as he said, but being influenced by Clooney and others. He then started what was a onshore life, and he got a job thanks to the influence of a powerful friend as what was called surveyor of the tides of Liverpool. He was a kind of a customs officer, but it was a pretty big job, and he got it through the patronage of a friend. And his job was to go out and inspect incoming ships. And he was paid £150 a year, which was a big salary for that. But it was in Liverpool, which was to this day a big port and also a big slave ship port in those days. So Newton had this land-based job of inspecting ships. And Liverpool, then and now, was a pretty godless city. It was a seaman's port, and it was also a big slave ship port. And slavery, for a long time, didn't worry Newton very much morally, which surprises everybody who now looks back. But we look back through the lens of today and not through the lens of history. And the world did not think, I'm sorry to say, that slavery was a great evil. Everybody was on the take from slavery, including churches, including very respectable businessmen who went to church regularly. And it is astonishing to have to tell a young audience this, but slavery was not an immoral trade in the eyes of 90% of the population when Newton was still part of it. but I think Newton must have been getting worried because he was reading the Bible so thoroughly. But at the beginning, he was not an anti-slavery man. How did he become an anti-slavery man? I think that's your question. Well, we don't exactly know, but roughly speaking, he joined the church. He was ordained in the Church of England after quite a long struggle. The Church of England did not want to ordain him for some years, not because he was a slave ship captain. No, that didn't worry them. It was because, wait for it, he had too much enthusiasm. Now, that must sound a very strange phrase to you for banning somebody from being a priest. But in those days, the words too much enthusiasm meant you'd been a Methodist. And Newton had not quite been a Methodist, but he'd been a great supporter of the Methodists. And they and the Church of England were not going on. So for complicated church politics reason, it took Newton considerable time to get ordained as a Church of England priest. And I think once he was a Church of England priest, he then read the Bible even more deeply, preached the word even more regularly, and gradually, I think it dawned on him that slavery was absolutely hostile to the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings, indeed, of the whole Bible. So he began to move, and there were other people moving at that time. There were people called the Clapham sect, who were a group of well-meaning Christians who really started the anti-slavery. And in the middle of them was a man called William Wilberforce. Now, William Wilberforce was socially at the other end of the spectrum to John Newton. William Wilberforce was what we would call in England a posh boy. He came from a smart family, a wealthy family, and he was sort of related to the nobility and the gentry, and he was rich. And extraordinarily enough, he met Newton because Wilberforce had an aunt who had heard that there was this remarkable preacher up in Northamptonshire or Bedfordshire called John Newton. And so she made the journey, not a small journey from London, going by coaches, I expect, because there were no trains or motor cars, to go and hear John Newton preach. And Newton invited her and I think it was her nephew, young William Wilberforce, to stay in the vicarage, which was a rather large vicarage with several bedrooms. And so the young William Wilberforce, aged about 10 years old, stayed in the vicarage and heard Newton preach. Didn't form a great friendship with him, but I think he was fascinated by Newton's stories. Newton at one point had been flogged by the Royal Navy for desertion. And there's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but that Newton peeled the shirt off his back and showed young William Wilberforce the scar marks of the cat o' nine tails whip that had been applied to him in a naval flogging. It was a very beautiful, brutal thing. So Wilberforce was interested in Newton from an early. Anyway, their paths completely diverged. Newton went on being a humble preacher, very good one. Newton became a young member of Parliament. He was rich, he was fashionable, he made money or lost money at the gambling clubs of London. But Wilberforce suddenly became spiritually restless in his own right. And he thought that his life of being a member of Parliament, being a gambler, being a posh boy, being fashionable, young MP, young congressman in your vocabulary, was not right. So he decided, well, that amazing man Newton, who was a great teacher, maybe I should try and meet him. So Wilberforce wrote to Newton saying, can we meet secretly? He said, as though this was some rather wicked thing to do for an MP to meet a preacher. But they did meet, and Newton and Wilberforce formed a friendship which went very deep, and first of all started Wilberforce on his deep commitment to being a socially active Christian. And Wilberforce said to Newton, "I want to go into the church like you, Mr. Newton." And Newton said, "Now listen here, Mr. Wilberforce, take my advice. You can do more for God by staying where you are as a young congressman, a young MP, and helping with the gospel than you can by becoming a clergyman like me." And they had a great, great friendship. And then Newton influenced Wilberforce enormously. But before that started, Wilberforce had started to decide that someone ought to be campaigning against slavery. And he started in the House of Commons, seemed a completely lost cause when he began. But he did begin. And then he realized what a wonderful ally he'd got in Newton, because in order to get things changed, as you do in America or democratic societies like Britain today, you have to campaign, which means you have to make speeches, you have to go in front of congressional committees, you have to go in front of cabinet ministers, prime ministers or presidents, and have to make your case. And Wilberforce was pretty good at making his case, but Newton was his trump card, because he could say, here is a witness to what the slave trade was like. Here is someone who can testify from first-hand evidence how brutal it was, how terrible it was, how murderous it was. And it was Newton as chief witness which helped Wilberforce, after 30 years of campaigning. It wasn't a quick fix at all. That's how the slave trade was broken in England. And it was broken by Wilberforce as leader, but by Newton as the chief witness. And without Newton, it wouldn't have been broken. So he was very, very important. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. We've left out an awful lot. And one of the things we've left out is Newton's general influence on religious life. And here we should come to Newton's hymns and spend a few moments on that. On the whole, church people in the 18th century thought that hymn singing was slightly sinful. This is complete nonsense. Now we all say how wonderful it is when people sing hymns. But to sing in church was thought to be vaguely naughty, at least. And it was only sort of really rather wild churches and wild men who did it. But there were some very good hymn singers and musicians, and Newton was one of them. And he was pushed in this direction by a poet called Cooper. It's spelled Cowper. And Cooper was a really disturbed young man, but a poet who wandered somehow into Newton's orbit. And Newton said, well, come and stay with me in my vicarage, and let's see if we can write some poems or hymns together. And they wrote terrific hymns. There's something called, I think it's the Olney, it was the name of the village, hymn book. And they wrote together something like 150 hymns. And Cooper wrote some of the best ones. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. But the ones which are most famous, and you've named a couple of them, but the most famous of all was Amazing Grace. And Newton meant it to be a bit of Sunday school teaching. He was trying to illustrate grace, illustrate a sermon. And he wrote the words. Who wrote the tune? Nobody knows. But quite possibly there were, in those days, there were American hymn book or songbook compilers, and there were some American songbook compilers, and one of them, it is thought, this is the most romantic theory of where the tune for Amazing Grace came from. There were sort of in the cotton fields of places like Alabama and Mississippi, there were singers. As they picked the cotton, they sung their own tunes. And this songwriter heard this tune, which we all know, Amazing Grace, and he wrote it down and he applied it to Newton's words. Now, there are other theories of where the tune for Amazing Grace came from. You might think, well, bingo, that's it. The tune was found, the words were found. Actually, they were forgotten for 50, 100 years. And then, more than anybody else, the American Civil Rights Movement of the 60s and 50s heard this tune. It was being played in black churches. And one or two singers popularized it, and it became the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement, and then really the anthem of the world. I think it was Grace mentioned that how frequently it is now sung. In my experience, you can hardly go to a wedding or a funeral in the United States or a church service without sooner or later hearing Amazing Grace. And Newton, from his celestial perch, I'm sure would be astonished at his words and this unknown tune are put together. But if you say, who in the world left a deep Christian message on the world? Well, I'm sure there are many writers who think they've done that, many preachers, many sermon writers. But I would say that you might consider giving first prize to Newton because Amazing Grace has struck chords. Its words go so deep into the Christian gospel, and so many people relate to Amazing Grace. I won't attempt to repeat them now, but if you say who is one of the biggest influences of human hearts towards Christ's teachings, I would say the combination of the words and the music of Amazing Grace might deserve first prize in that. So on top of everything I've been talking about, there's a slave trade, and I may say Amazing Grace, the song played no part in the slave trade was not abolished in England until about 1807, 1810. And then the Royal Navy had to fight all over the world against slave ships. So it took a long, long time. But God often takes his time into making things happen. But Newton played an absolutely pivotal role in the abolition of the slave trade at the time, and much later through Amazing Grace in winning human hearts to the Christian message.
Wow. Do you have a favorite hymn by Newton?
Do I have a favorite hymn by Newton? Well, I love Amazing Grace. Who doesn't? Actually, my favorite hymn is Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken, which is played to a great tune. And that is just, to me, theologically even richer than Amazing Grace. But that's a personal taste. Two of you produced hymns by Newton, written by Newton, which you love. And so there are many ways of tuning into the Newton wavelength. But his hymns, whether it's any of the ones we've been talking about today, but Amazing Grace must win first prize only because it's just had such a huge influence. And that is what Newton will surely be most remembered for once people know it. A lot of people don't know that Newton wrote Amazing Grace. And you can remember Newton for being a slave ship captain who was redeemed and changed and transformed by God. You can remember him as a great preacher and writer. You can remember him as the author of Amazing Grace. But if you put all these together as a life, it was a wonderful life. Mm. Any other question? I think we're almost running out of time, are we, Simonetta? I don't know. I'll go on. Any other questions?
Well, Reverend Aitken, thank you. We are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. So make sure to check out our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org.
I will.
We are also offering a copy of Simonetta Carr's biography for kids about John Newton. You can enter on our website. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Sean and Priscilla, I am Grace. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.